The threat of a Middle East conflict is no longer measured by geographic proximity but by the systemic choke points of global energy, where a disruption to the Strait of Hormuz now impacts 20% of the world's oil and gas flows. With Singapore gasoil and jet fuel surging by 57% and 114% respectively since late February, the crisis has transitioned from a military standoff into a high-stakes map of economic exposure. To understand which nations will fracture first, we must analyze the specific dependencies of the economies currently scrambling to deploy record-breaking emergency reserves. Financial sovereignty is a fragile illusion when the circulatory system of global commerce is constricted. While missiles may remain confined to a specific theater of operations, the economic fallout migrates instantly, manifesting as a systemic seizure rather than a localized wound. The current friction involving Iran has effectively redrawn the world's financial geography, transforming it into a live heat map of industrial vulnerability. Proximity to the line of fire is irrelevant. What matters is how deeply a nation's internal combustion is tethered to the specific logistics of the Middle East. Consider the global energy architecture as a high-pressure hydraulic system. When a single valve like the Strait of Hormuz is squeezed, the pressure does not just rise at the point of contact, it threatens to burst pipes in factories and homes thousands of miles away. The scale of this constriction is staggering. Data from Reuters on March the 15th and 16th confirms that roughly 20% of the planetary movement of oil and gas is currently strangled by the situation in the Strait. In an unprecedented defensive maneuver, the International Energy Agency has sanctioned a record-breaking coordinated release of over 400 million barrels from emergency stockpiles. This is not merely a shortage of raw materials. It is a wholesale collapse of logistical certainty. When a primary artery is obstructed, the fallout is a cascading failure of confidence. Shipping lanes turn into high-risk gambles, forcing insurance premiums into the stratosphere and leaving tankers idling in expensive uncertainty. This friction triggers a desperate hunt for liquidity in the physical market, as refiners scramble for dwindling feedstock and governments are forced to break the glass on their national reserves. If we view the global economy as a high-performance engine, we must ask ourselves, which specific components seize up first when the oil pressure drops to zero? The answer lies in the secondary market of refined products, the actual blood that keeps the real economy breathing. Crude oil is just the raw ingredient. The crisis is truly defined by the scarcity of usable fuel. Market reporting from March 16th paints a grim picture of this disparity. Since the escalation began in late February, the price of Singapore gasoil has leaped by 57%, while the cost of jet fuel has skyrocketed by 114%. This suggests that the world is not just facing a supply crisis, but a functional paralysis of transportation and industry. Japan stands as the canary in this industrial coal mine. Despite its geographic distance from the conflict, its reliance on Middle Eastern energy is nearly absolute, sourcing approximately 95% of its crude and 11% of its liquefied natural gas from the region, according to reports from March the 14th and 16th. The Japanese government has moved beyond rhetoric, signaling a dire shift in policy by planning a record release of 80 million barrels from its national strategic reserves. This move, equivalent to 45 days of national consumption, underscores the severity of the threat. While Japan maintains a total of 254 days of oil in reserve, and is considering the release of an additional 12 million barrels held in partnership with Middle Eastern entities, the psychological barrier has been broken. The crisis has officially migrated from the front pages of newspapers into the cold mathematics of national survival and consumer price indices. The shockwaves extend further into the Asia-Pacific corridor, hitting nations that lack the domestic refining capacity to buffer the blow. Australia and Indonesia find themselves acutely exposed as primary fuel importers. Australia's daily requirement of 900,000 barrels consists largely of diesel, the lifeblood of its logistics and mining sectors, while Indonesia's daily intake of 600,000 barrels is heavily weighted toward gasoline. For these nations, the conflict is not a distant political dispute, but an immediate tax on every kilometre travelled and every kilowatt generated. National resilience is an equation where the most dangerous variable is not the volume of raw crude, but the availability of the refined lifeblood that powers modern machinery. Reuters has identified a specific class of high-risk nations whose vulnerability stems from a heavy reliance on imported secondary fuels rather than just the primary product. Australia serves as a stark example of this logistical tightrope walk. Down under, the entire industrial skeleton, comprising heavy mining operations, massive freight networks, and core industry, is bolted to the availability of diesel. According to reporting from March 16th, Australia is operating on a razor-thin margin, possessing only about 30 days of domestic fuel supply. Meanwhile, in Indonesia, the threat is more visceral for the average citizen. Here, the economy is sensitive to the price of gasoline, which acts as a direct conduit for inflationary pressure on household budgets. These are not necessarily the world's most impoverished nations. Rather, they are the architects of economies built atop the shifting sands of imported fuel logistics. While crude oil occupies the headlines, it is the refined diesel and gasoline that actually possess the power to paralyze trucking fleets, erode mining margins, and deliver a blunt force trauma to the consumer. Across the Atlantic, the European continent faces a different brand of energy-induced hemorrhage. While Europe maintains a slightly lower direct physical dependence on Middle Eastern crude compared to its neighbors in Asia, it remains a captive audience to the volatility of global pricing. Reuters reported on March 16th that European natural gas prices have surged by nearly 60% since the conflict began in late February. This spike is a poison pill for the entire industrial cost structure. When energy is the invisible tax on everything, every sector begins to bleed simultaneously. From the chemical plants and heating systems to aviation fuel and heavy transport, the rising cost of power acts like a parasitic drain on the economy. This systemic escalation means that airlines, logistics operators, and factories are forced to raise prices at the exact same time, creating an inflationary spiral that persists even when consumer demand begins to falter. The most fragile links in this global chain are the importers already burdened by existing financial ailments. For countries struggling with weak currencies or pre-existing trade imbalances, the current crisis is a fire being fed by high-octane fuel. On March 16th, IMF Managing Director Kristalina Georgieva issued a sobering warning that a sustained 10% increase in oil prices through the year could inject roughly 40 basis points into global inflation. For the world's weakest balance sheets, the impact is significantly more severe. Expensive energy is a corrosive force that eats away at current account balances and strips central banks of their ability to navigate economic downturns. These nations do not require a literal dry pump to suffer. They are broken by the mere price of the heat. If financial shocks are a contagion, they are currently spreading with predatory speed toward those with the least immunity. This raises the inevitable question of whether any player remains shielded from this systemic fracture. Is there a superpower currently standing in a more insulated position than its peers? Fuel and gasoline, specifically for Australia, which imports roughly 900,000 barrels per day. Contrast this with the American powerhouse, where the arithmetic of energy reveals a surprising shield. According to Energy Information Administration figures cited by Reuters on March 2nd, the United States pulls less than 0.9 million barrels per day from the Gulf, a mere drop in the bucket compared to its total daily appetite of over 20 million barrels. Yet, do not mistake a lack of physical reliance for total immunity. The virus of volatility simply travels through a different nervous system for the Americans. Even with minimal direct imports, the United States remains tethered to the global price tag, struggling with shifting inflation expectations and tightening financial conditions. By March 16th, Reuters reported Brent crude stubbornly hovering above $104 a barrel, casting a long shadow of uncertainty over central banks from the Federal Reserve to the Bank of England and the monetary authorities in Europe, Japan, and Australia. These institutions now find their interest rate blueprints blurred by the fog of a globalized price shock. Inside any given economy, the first casualties are never found in government offices but on the industrial front lines. Every sector that breathes fuel feels the tightening of the noose. Aviation is the immediate victim as jet fuel costs take flight. Shipping and logistics firms see their margins vanish as transit routes become both more expensive and less reliable. For the giants of mining and heavy industry, the crisis arrives in the form of soaring diesel and freight bills. Manufacturing plants are strangled by the dual pressure of power costs and raw input prices. Finally, the wave crashes over the average citizen, manifesting as a surcharge on every grocery item and transport ticket touched by the distribution chain. The March 16th data on Singapore gasol and diesel confirms this. The shock has transitioned from a crude oil headline into a corrosive tax on the daily operating fluids of the real economy. This conflict has forced a brutal hierarchy of vulnerability onto the world stage. Japan sits at the top, a wealthy titan deeply compromised by its hunger for Middle Eastern crude and liquefied natural gas. Australia and Indonesia follow, paralyzed by their structural reliance on foreign refined products. Europe is caught in a vice where energy costs feed directly into a feedback loop of industrial decay and inflation. Below them sit the fragile importers, where expensive oil acts as a magnifying glass for every pre-existing economic fracture. The enduring lesson of this crisis is that modern warfare does not merely advance through ground troops. It marches through tanker insurance premiums, refinery outputs, and trade deficits. The most severe casualties are rarely the ones closest to the fire, but those most inextricably linked to the network that has ceased to function. In the current era, economic survival is no longer a matter of where you stand on a map, but how tightly you are bound to the system.